From stand-up comic to one of Australia's most celebrated funny women, her mission is to bring laughter into people's lives. Today, Jean Kittson is an MC, performer and writer who tackles life's most confronting topics with her trademark humour. Jean Kittson, welcome to 1+1. You've done so much over your life. I mean, I know you still as a comedian from the TV, but these days you talk about important social topics like menopause and palliative care, and you still do your comedy work. I wonder, when you define yourself, or say you're sitting next to someone on the plane who doesn't know who you are, how do you say what you do?
I used to say I was a performer, and then when I was actually going to an obstetrician and he looked at, and I was filling out and it said work performer, and he looked up and he goes, "Oh, you're a performer, are you?" And I went, "I'll never write performer again." But usually I would still define myself as a comedian, really. That's what I am now. And even though I do a lot of advocacy for people and I write, it's always in a humorous way. So that's how I define myself. And a mother, and a wife, and a woman.
Perfect.
A perfect package.
I find humour something that can be very, very difficult to inject into certain topics. For example, I find something like racism one that's really hard to laugh about. Have you ever found that you're restricted by your moral beliefs or...
I'm always restricted by my moral beliefs. I wouldn't do anything that I thought was immoral or that would trivialise. I try to find humour in a situation, but I'm not flippant about it, and I try not to trivialise it. So if I was finding humour in palliative care, in death and dying, I would try and find the things that are common, first of all, the things in my life and how I've handled them, and the humour in how I've handled it myself and how I feel about it, and then try to make that into a more universal feeling about death and dying. But I would never trivialise things. There's just so much in life that I don't know anything about, and I think it's the same with everyone. We're not taught how to handle things, even childbirth. That came as a complete surprise to me. It did, because you read all the books and you think, I thought the baby would be born, and then the baby, you put the baby to the breast and you suckle the baby, and the baby, is suckling away happily, and the mother gets that far away, look in her eye, and the baby falls into a deep milky sleep, and and then the mother presses on, running the Department of Finance or knitting or something like that. But that didn't happen with me. So I had to. My baby didn't, suckle and then sleep. She suckled and then screamed because she had reflux. Before I had a baby, I thought reflux was a vacuum cleaner. I had no idea about childbirth. I had no idea really about being married and all that sort of partnerships and all these things. I had no idea about palliative care before I was invited to speak at a conference, and then learnt a lot about it, and then I had my own experience of it.
Because you actually grew up, I think, with your grandparents either living very close or in the house, is that right?
Well, yes, and I don't want to be flippant about this either, but my grandfather moved in after he had a couple of heart attacks into our house, and he moved in, and in the whole time my grandfather was there, I cannot remember him saying 2 words to us. But he was really ill. He had emphysema, so he probably had lung cancer, he'd had heart attacks. You didn't have care for them then. And he eventually went to a nursing home. But in the meantime, your family cares for the person. But I don't know whether I'd call it caring. I mean, we tried to care, but we didn't have any facilities or anything like that. That's this whole thing. You want to care for your loved ones as they get older. You want them to remain a part of the family, but how do you do that while making sure they're not suffering?
Were you a performer as a child? I mean, did you perform for your grandfather and for your parents to get a laugh?
I did, but I remember possibly the first interview I did for a magazine, and they said, were you the class clown? And I said, yes, and then someone rang me up, an old friend rang me up and said, I don't remember you being funny at school. And I thought, that's the last time I'm going to say I was a class clown. I thought I was funny. But I guess I enjoyed making people laugh. I remember one of the first times I made someone laugh and the feeling it gave me of being, bringing humour and everyone laughing. It was a really visceral feeling. I remember thinking, gosh, that feels good. So I guess that's been my propensity. And then when I was at college, Teachers College, doing drama and things, I enjoyed doing the comedy rather than the serious things. I really enjoyed the comedy.
Why were you going to become a teacher?
Well, I actually didn't even think about the teaching part.
Oh.
And we weren't even really taught to teach in my course.
Didn't you actually get a posting as a teacher?
Yes, I got a job with the Schools Commission, taking the arts to disadvantaged areas, which was a fantastic job. So I was up in the northwest of Victoria, travelling around, taking drama and dance to the different schools, primary schools and secondary schools, and it's very different now. But when I'd gone, we weren't really taught how to teach.
So you went from teaching and you got more interested in the performing and writing side, and then you find yourself auditioning as a stand-up comedian.
Yes.
Do you like that kind of very impromptu performing?
No, I know. So what I did was I wrote a piece with a character, in character. So I wrote a piece for a character called Bubbles. I thought, how am I going to go on stage? I was just trying to get work. How am I going to go on stage in front of, all these drunken audiences that I knew was a joke? They get drunk, they yell things out. How am I going to go on stage and not die of embarrassment and humiliation and try and make them laugh? And I thought, well, I need to be a character. So I wrote a character. She was called Bubbles. She was a stripper. She was a stripper from the Cross, because I'd lived for a couple of years up in Sydney and I knew the Cross quite well when I lived in Sydney. So I thought, these women, I knew women who'd worked in clubs and strip clubs, and they would seem to me to be fearless. It seemed that they had this carapace that just allowed them to be fearless on stage. So I thought, if I just have to have a persona where if people yell things out like, show us your pink bits or get off or, you're as funny as a fart, I won't go, oh, I know, I can't do this. That I would be able to come back with a wisecrack, but I had to have this, sassy persona.
I love what you say about having met some real strippers. You saw that they had this sort of rock-solid exterior. Is that what comedy takes, or is that what performance takes? I mean, is the person sitting next to me, is it a character? Is it the character Jean Kittson, or is it the person?
Well, it's when you're performing, you have to turn yourself on. You have to be on. I'm not like this around the breakfast table. Hi, kids! Isn't it a fabulous morning? Look at those eggs. They look like breasts to me. No, I don't do things like that. So we just, shuffle around and grunt at each other like every other family. But when you're performing, you have to find that part of yourself that is
larger than life,
enthusiastic, is entertaining. I remember after I'd done some performing on the big gig and things like that, and people wanted to talk to me. One of the first things I did was Steve Vizard had a Tonight Show, and I went on and he started asking questions, and I was sitting on the couch, it was and I started answering in a serious way. I just was thinking, I'll try and answer this exactly right or whatever. I'll delve into what I really think. And when I finished, my brother rang me up. He's 4 years younger than me. And he said, Jean, I saw you on the show. And I said, oh, Bill, yeah, how you going? What do you think? And he said, look, people don't really want to know what you think. They just want you to entertain them.
We had Jane Turner on this show last year, and I was surprised at how kind of quiet she was in the interview situation. And she said she likes to get into character, perform in the character, but she wasn't interested in putting herself out there as a personality. And she said, as you soon see, there is no personality.
Well, that's not true. She's a wonderful person. And she does character work. And that's mainly what I do too. Although over the years, because I've had to earn a living, I've been forced more and more into being, you could call it a personality, but not really, but performing as myself. So finding out my persona. Actually, it started with Marianne Fay and I when we did our show. And it was Kittson Fay, yeah. And it was the first time comedians had their own show on Australian telly, female comedians. So we had to find what the show was about, and both of us had always done character work. But on this, we felt like we had to introduce the show as ourselves, and we both found that extremely hard to find out, how to project ourselves publicly.
And I just couldn't help noticing, but you're wearing a man's suit.
Yes. You played some quintessential characters in the late 80s and 90s, and I'm thinking of Veronica, Glenn Huntley and Candida. From what you said earlier about watching strippers and prostitutes in King's Cross, what went into crafting those characters? Were they parts of you that were larger than life? Were they parts of other characters, for example, newsreaders and aerobics instructors that you saw or you met?
Well, Candida was part of my life.
Dear Candida, I am a personal fitness trainer, and I recently had a collision on my exercise bike.
When we went for the interviews for the big gig, we had to bring a character, we had to bring our own writing, we had to write and perform our own stuff. And I came along with a character called Doona, who is a new age hippie. And then, and Ted Robinson and Patrick Cook were interviewing us all. And then Ted said, we're looking for a character who could be physical. Do you think she could also go to gyms, be into aerobics? And because I say yes, because that's what I always say. Through my entire life, I just say yes to everything. And it gets me into a lot of trouble. But I said, yes, of course, aerobics, sure. And next thing you know, Doona's turned into Candida, and she's in Lycra, and she's swinging from Roman rings and on these machines. And I'd never been to a gym. And I only went to a gym when I was much, older, after having children. I went to a gym and I thought, why didn't I go to a gym? I could have got so much more material instead of making it up. So Candida's definitely a part of my life, whereas the characters like Veronica, Patrick Cook wrote Veronica.
That's your husband,
That's
isn't it?
my husband. I know, the big gig changed my life in so many ways. So Patrick Cook, who's a brilliant writer and cartoonist, and also my husband, he wrote Veronica, and Veronica just came out. She was there on the page, and he wrote the air hostess, and she was there on the page. We'd both come up with the idea of this air hostess who wasn't just the dim bimbo that flight attendants had usually been portrayed as. So, and then he wrote it. So those characters that are just sort of there, when they're well written, characters just come out.
Good evening, Veronica Glenn Hunter with the late news update. Leading tonight's bulletin, as Australian youth unemployment reaches the 100% mark, Prime Minister Keating strikes back with a plan to compel all citizens to deface a Queen's image on 10-cent pieces with very small moustaches.
And when you were, I suppose, on TV all the time and really one of our top comedians here, did you enjoy celebrity life? Did you have celebrity life?
I enjoyed people loving what I did. I enjoyed people coming up to me in the street and saying, I love what you do, and oh, you're so funny. You enjoyed that. I was quite old when I did that, comparatively speaking. So I'd had heaps of life before. I was 34 when I did the big gig. That was my first television. Before that, I'd been living in a communal house till I was 34. I was living in a communal house with no money and just mucking around with other, artists, performers and musicians doing our own thing. So I was never after fame or celebrity or success or whatever that meant. I was just after the next fun thing to do. So it did change my life. And there are things that you get with celebrity, like in the old days you used to get upgraded, maybe because I did Rose McLeod, the flight attendant. So if I went on a plane, I'd get, or if I couldn't be upgraded, they'd give me a little bottle of champagne or something, because apparently they used to use those hostess, the flight attendant footage as training films for all the flight attendants, how not to do it.
So just look out for our new plane. It's big, it's wide, it's pink, it's got a snout and a curly tail. Answers to the name of Porky. Suey chocks away!
So what makes you say yes to everything?
Because I love adventure. I love adrenaline. I love doing something I've never done before, and I get that from my mum and dad. My mum and dad really were, they still are, incredible people who went outside how they grew up and everything was expected of them, and travelled the world. And my mum had to leave school at 13, lived through the Depression, didn't have shoes, all that story. And then when she was just after the war, she was offered a trip, there was those trips overseas for £5. She took it and travelled the world by herself, growing up as a country girl with no education, but smart, really smart. And my dad travelled too with his cousin on push bikes all around the world. So we grew up with these stories of the world is an amazing place, and there's so much excitement in the world, and just grab it with both hands. So that's how we were brought up.
What is the most challenging thing that you've had to do?
I think motherhood and being a partner, all those long-term things, because as I said, I was in a communal house till I was 34, and I hadn't made any sort of proper commitment because I was just enjoying everything and going, if I didn't like something, I'd move on to something else, and just having fun. And then realising, and then just getting older and experience and going through hard times where you can't move on.
So as you've become more mature, let's say, you've started to talk and write books and discuss, and in your corporate work, you've taken all these issues that you've probably found have been hard, like grief and menopause and palliative care and dying, and you've somehow kind of channeled that into your performing personality as well, haven't you? Because you do manage to talk about difficult things, but you end up making people laugh about them.
Well, I try to make it as the difficult subjects as human, full of human frailty and humour as life is. And for most of us, we can have a laugh about things. That's also what I grew up with, that to laugh at ourselves. And my family were very good at laughing at themselves. And even when difficult things happened, it could be turned into a story full of humour and pathos. I mean, they're two sides of the coin, tragedy and comedy. And then you just find it. You find it, and so you present it in a way that is just as human as possible and as non-confronting. So I can talk to just people about menopause and menstruation and whatever you like, where people will be crying and laughing at the same time and going, oh my God, I really, we really need to be able to talk about these things. And relationships between men and women, and then grief as being a part of life. That's one thing I suppose I wasn't brought up to deal with, and that was grief. I think because my parents' generation lived through a world war. And when at the end of the war, they were encouraged not to talk about it, to get on with their lives, and to get on with their lives and to forget the people that they mourned as if it was, or to put it as a separate part of their life, as if it was something separate and apart from this life. So they were taught not to talk about death and dying, really, and they pass that on to their children. We'll just keep things as wonderful as possible, and will avoid the things in life that are painful. But there comes a point when you can't avoid them. And to learn about that grief can be good. Grief is an essential part of life. And because people employ me to be funny, I have a responsibility to bring happiness into people's lives, to make them laugh. That is my responsibility, just as my responsibility is to help my kids grow up to be good people and to support my friends and family and things. It's also my responsibility, my job. You know, it's like if there's a doctor in the house, it's your responsibility to put your hand up.
Particularly with your book on menopause, which was written about 18 months ago, are you comfortable being known as that menopause woman?
Well, I didn't know I was going to be known as menopause woman. I don't know whether I even thought about that I'm the menopause woman, or whether things would change for me, or how people saw me would change. But
have they seen you in a different light?
I think some have, but then you realise that it's not how people see you, it's how you see yourself. And I feel, you know, I'm so glad I've been able to talk about menopause. Really, I still talk about it a lot. I talk to hundreds of people a week about it. And as I said, people just, the stories they share with me are very intimate and fantastic stories, because it's also about fertility as well. There's so many interesting things I found out. One wonderful old elderly gentleman came to me when I was doing a talk about menopause in a bookstore, and he came up to me and he said, "You're right about GPs, about getting 3 quotes, because I always say, get a really good GP, get 3 quotes like you would a plumber. Go and interview GPs until you find the one who actually knows about menopause." And he said, when I was being trained as a doctor in the 50s, he said, it was in England, and he said, the only thing I remember about being even menopause was being mentioned was when we were all students, we were sitting in a theatre, they wheeled in this woman of menopausal age, she was wheeled into the middle of the theatre, and she looked up at us all and she said, "My husband doesn't bother me anymore." And that was all that he said he ever was taught about menopause. And then one professor said she thinks there's a subtle political agenda that wants to deny women treatment. Because when you hear HRT being spoken, I always say, show of hands if you think HRT is linked with breast cancer. And there's still so many hands from the World Health Institute report that came out in 2002. And that's since been shown as being terribly flawed in a report that came out in 2012, but that wasn't reported on widely. So women still are denying themselves treatment. And she said she feels like women's hormones are spoken about as if they were poisonous. As if there was something poisonous about women's hormones, and she finds that totally offensive. And she said, I think there's a subtle political agenda out there that wants to deny women treatment that will enable them, will give them the ability to lead a fully functioning life. Because a lot of women cannot lead a fully functioning life when they're going through menopause. Their hormones play havoc on them. Physically, women get all sorts of things going on, you know, with them. Aching bones and feet, and not only the hot flushes so that they can't even sit in meetings without running like Niagara Falls, and if they feel like they can't get the treatment they need, then they leave their jobs. And there's more and more statistics coming out now. The Australian Human Resources Institute is starting to do some research for the first time. And La Trobe Uni is doing research, and they find that only 3% of women in the workforce would ever mention the word menopause. And most of them think that if they do, they will be sidelined for leadership positions, they will be thought of as being old, and they will be seen as past their use-by date. That's what women think. So, you know, there's a lot of work to be done out there.
I mean, you've learnt all this stuff subsequent to writing your book, presumably. Does it make you angry that older women, in a sense, are kind of like institutionally discriminated against?
I'm very angry about anyone who's discriminated against for their age, and I think women have so much pressure put on them to look younger than they are, as if their age is some sort of use-by date. Yeah, it does make me angry. I mean, what I've found out, there's most of the information I found out while I was writing the book, but I have to say there's new information I've heard. Like there was this research recently. I always thought that the only other species to go through menopause were some of the higher primates. But there is one species that does go through menopause, and that are killer whales. Killer whales are the only other species that anyone knows of that goes through menopause. And there was some research done recently by these scientists in white coats in England who wanted to find out, basically they wanted to find out why killer whales, when they go through menopause, don't just die. Because it is, you know, Mother Nature's imperative. It is an imperative of nature that we breed, that there is survival of the species. So why when a female of the species goes through menopause, why don't they just die? That's what they wanted to find out, which is interesting. So, even though it makes me angry. So, what they found out, the great thing they found out, is that these whales know where the salmon is. They know where the food is. They know where the safe places to go. When there's any sort of pressure on the pod or in the environment, or when they really need to, you know, they're under strain for survival, they help the pod survive because they know stuff. And that's what older people do, men and women. We know stuff.
I don't want to finish on an angry or, you know, too serious a note. So before I let you go, you were saying that you get wiser as you get older. What about humour? Do we get funnier or less funny as we get old?
We don't get less funny as we get older. We still have great, you know, you just have to look at a night with your girlfriends to know that women had the greatest sense of humour, and I think you just, you know, you laugh about more things. My mum's now 90 and my dad's 88, and I just saw them yesterday, and Dad said mum's vision impaired. She's got macular degeneration. So she was lying in bed with her talking books on, and Dad fell over and he couldn't get up, and he was lying on the floor for an hour till he could get himself up again. And they were just laughing about it. They're amazing people, and I just think laughing about our human frailties and ourselves, first of all. I mean, I don't know how he laughed about it, but he made us laugh about it. But I think humour is such a great way to deal with all the difficult things in life. If we can find the humour in it, it just is a salve. It's so healing. I love humour so much. And if I can bring it into difficult situations and make people laugh, and laugh at ourselves as human beings with all our frailties and fears, then that's the most fun job I can think of doing.
Jean Kittson, it's been a great pleasure. Thank you for speaking with me on 1+1.
Thanks, Jane. Thank you.
Thanks for your company. 1+1 is available on iView. You can browse the archive or contact us via the website. Stay in touch via Facebook and Twitter, and I'll see you next time.